that flies. So taking that perspective becomes super important. Fourth, programs don't work. It's programs under certain contexts with certain mechanisms being activated work itself. So I think bringing that knowledge of context, mechanism, outcomes becomes super critical. And the final sort of introductory comment is the big area in evaluation is not impact evaluation, it's developmental evaluation, a story for another day. But the idea here is the evaluation itself should help you develop it. Now, having done this, a few quick questions I ask. Number one, you cannot judge if a program is successful if you don't build a clear expectation of how the program is supposed to work. That's where the notion of theories of change, logic, morals, and all that come in, most of it rather poorly done. Not with as deep a knowledge of context, mechanism, and outcomes that are required. Very few, almost none, with an understanding of how long would this change process take. So Abhijit, the real surprise for me with Samachar Jodi was I did not expect so many changes so quickly. So this is so part of my question really is how much of that is context driven, etc. That's one set of questions around expectations of. You remember, you cannot judge success if you don't build a clear sense of where you cannot say our journey is going well if you don't have a clear roadmap of how you're going to get there. There are a series of other questions about how and this is important in interventions that are more dynamic. How will the evaluation itself contribute to the growth of the intervention? Okay? Otherwise, it's a clear black and white kind of intervention. So I don't want to spend too much time. But I think I'm not the least bit hesitant to answer impact questions. I think Samachar Jodi is ripe for impact questions to actually say, has it worked? Even the most traditional pre-post survey itself, bring it on. We've got to do other things that we'll have a chance to talk about. But that's one kind of issues of impact. But the deeper issue of impact is actually understanding how has your own knowledge of the theory of change changed over time itself. So that's quite a fundamental issue that almost never gets done. The final points are really, it's almost never about the interventions in the 30 communities of Maharashtra. The deeper question is what needs to get spread as a result of this intervention. The other deep question, and this is my fundamental question to every single villager I met, if Samachar Joridar was to stop tomorrow, in 6 months from now, in a year from now, do you have enough momentum to sustain this intervention? So often the relationship between our research/evaluation and questions of sustainability are often unclear, and I think that's where we've got to sort of focus on.
Thank you, Sanjeev, for he has used this term, referred to this intervention, Samachar Joridar, for you might, many of you might not have heard. Just to contextualize that, it's an intervention which CHSJ, along with 5 agencies, implements it. It's going to come to an end in December, using animators, first looking at in their own individual changes and then at societal changes. That's what he's been referring to. I just wanted to share. It's interesting that one of the things that he said, what is the theory of change and how that theory of change itself has changed over the implementation period of intervention. We'll definitely have questions around that, and we'll come back to you. Ravi, what's your take on how do you look at?
You think is there anything left for me now? Well, I think I would keep it simple. I think Yakur really gave a very comprehensive conceptualization of social change, which is very similar to what I also subscribe to. And so as the name suggests, when as a researcher, whether I am engaged as an evaluator or as a researcher looking at the broader patterns of things, for me the issue is that we are studying a process because it's a change. So, and the elements of the process become important for me as a researcher to capture and measure. So in my conceptualization, I look at the process as something which is dynamic, which is complex, which is happening at multiple levels, and therefore, there are some aspects of the change that are tangible and visible, and some aspects of the change that are not tangible and they're not visible. Some aspects that you see tangible are not perhaps as profound as they appear, and some of the part of the processes that are not so apparently tangible are perhaps far more profound in their impact than what we think. So, okay, so that's the complexity of the change process. And I think as a researcher, I would, in my conceptualization, start identifying the nature of complexity, the levels at which I want to capture those change processes, and I like to see the pathways of change process, in some ways try and conceptualize that in the beginning itself using some methods and some ideas or from the literature and other pieces anyway. So for me, this social change as a phenomena is a process that needs to be conceptualized with all its complexities and our ability to capture those complexities. I think I'll just stop here because I'm sure you're going to ask us very precise methodological questions after this, or there may be questions from the audience, and it may give us an opportunity to give more concrete examples of what we capture and what we don't capture and yet factor them into the pathways, or as Sanjeev says, in theory of change that we put in the beginning. So that's what my take on.
Thanks, Ravi. We don't want to, have this as a linear. We first go to Kausar and then to Jakar and so on. But still, Kausar, you talked about the context. So how does what's your experience been in studying changes? How has the context, the cultural issues in which a program is embedded or a project is embedded? How does that influence studying the change?
Before that, I'd just like to specifically answer this question. Just like to clarify, I really take this seriously. This well-known saying from Louis Carroll: "If you don't know where you're going, then any road will do." And I find a lot of people in health just do a lot, and they will tell you what they've done, and then try and look very puzzled when the outcomes are not there, and say, "Oh, we should reduce diarrheal deaths, and we are telling women to wash their hands and boil the water, and the children are still dying." Or maybe the management has improved a little. So I find that they have not conceived what change do they really want, and what is the change in the context that will lead to better outcomes, to put it simply. So in view of that, so for me, when I said, where am I going, as I said earlier, I really believe that any individual or a group, and since larger transformation, I believe, will have to come from collective action, so that's a given for me. So it's not the individual who will bring, they may bring individual change, but the larger changes are needed. So for collective action, it's very important is that who will be identifying what change is needed, who will be identifying how that change is to be brought about. And so the context become important. I was part of a multi-country study on women's empowerment in Muslim contexts, and we sort of put it deliberately, it was context, recognizing that the context will differ. There were 4 countries, but even within Pakistan, between the urban and the rural, within rural, you have different groups. So the context keep changing. But the problem, so our framework, our research framework really, since it was participatory, we used a lot of participatory tools where the women became the analysts to say what does empowerment mean, which empowerment they like, which they don't like. Because I feel as an outsider, because I'm also an activist, and an activist, we never go around telling people what to do. We sort of talk with them and we say, we don't understand what you're saying, but look, these are the rights, etc. So that equality of all becomes very important. So even if I'm talking to men, and when the men said in one village where they stopped women from going to an event within that, so I told men, I said, and the men wanted to talk, I said, what is your fear? So they looked around, they said, if a women were to go out, they'll get lost, they wouldn't know the way. I said, but the event was in a school which was in your village, so they're not likely to get. So I feel you can talk on an equal footing. So for me, so what we did in the women's empowerment one, we did the participatory poverty assessment where the poor were the analysts. We said the economist is not the expert of poverty, the nutritionist is not, the poor are the expert because they live it. So they did the entire analysis. So I look for So for me, when I write report, I'll write all this. That look, I'm no one to say. I can analyze and comment, but the narrative is of the people, and that narrative has to go. My primary research question is, which I still have not been able to answer, is how long will it change for communities to develop this cycle, the Freudian cycle of reflection, analysis, and action. That's what I aim for. I've seen it working, but once, as you say, people are, donors, especially institutions, sustainability of that. I said, in Pakistan, the government can't sustain itself without outside help. You want the poor to sustain themselves. So the counter arguments have to be made. But that question, because 5 years time, the fund's over, the department says, okay, now you go and teach this, and so your interaction with the communities. So that question remains, but I know for a fact that yes, they do get into that cycle, but that partnership between the outsider and the people has to be maintained.
I think it's an interesting point that you raised. On the duration of interventions, Jaga, your work is on looking at changes in society. So what type of time frames do you consider, when you look at, changes that you have tracked, earlier?
Thanks. So we don't necessarily study typically entire societies as such in the kind of abstract, but often very kind of specific research with groups in different countries, in different contexts, in India, in Kenya, Uganda, and so on. And first of all, before the time question, the context then is in a sense everything, because gender relations is about that context, and it always differs. It is about context. How do we conceptualize that context? First of all, not only is it locally specific, obviously, but it's also entirely historically dependent. So in India, for example, it's different from in Kenya. The last few years of sexual and gender-based violence in Nairobi has its drivers and causes which look different from they do in Uttar Pradesh, for example. In India in Kenya to do with post-election violence, for example, and in India there's all sorts of factors, including the current new political shifts and new governments and so on, within the context of colonization and the history of colonization, which it has in common with Uganda and Kenya as well. So there are not only differences, but there are also similarities. And the point about that is that context is locally specific, but it's globally nested, and it's always globally nested. And the relations between global spaces, if you like, and local dynamics matter, and they continue to matter. They matter today in Delhi, they matter today in Nairobi. And in terms, I was quite intrigued by some of the things that Ravi said about contextualizing the context in terms of a process. Because gender is about social relations and power, it's very much about processes of power, and there's a lot of research on power. For example, John Gaventas at IDS came up with this idea of a power cube, looking at different, not only scales of power in terms of local to global, but also different spaces of power, from open spaces, invited spaces, more closed spaces of power, and also different, what he talks of as forms of power, from kind of very visible forms of power to kind of opaque forms to hidden forms of power. Some of the things that Ravi mentioned about the less obvious intangible aspects of these processes become really important. But it can become quite easy to talk about power in abstract terms, and those terms are still quite abstract, and we need more gendered terms. And I think the ecological model helps quite a lot in terms of looking at kind of gendered power as internal to the person, as interpersonal, as institutional and institutionally embedded, as well as ideological. And that's crucial, because that's crucial to how we internalize gender, power, and difference. So those are the levels. And there's also, of course, different kinds of power. Yesterday at the opening ceremony, there were some reflections about handing over power and so on. Our usual assumption is that power is power. Person A has power over person B. Male is more powerful than female. But there are other forms of power. There's power with, collective power. There's power within. There's power to do things, capacity. And development is very often focused on capacity development, individuals' capacities and so on. And the final kind of dimension or plane of analysis that I like to use in terms of thinking about context and historical trajectories is what Nancy Fraser talks about in terms of feminism and capitalism, which is that making the point that power structures are multidimensional and they're gendered. So she talks about representation, recognition, and 3 R's, I forget the third now, but anyway, so there's a material dimension where we have male privilege and female discrimination against women. We have an ideological dimension, which is in all our lives, which is male supremacy versus the subordination of women. We have a cultural dimension, the kind of marginalization of feminine perspectives and women's issues from a male-centered view of the world, which is also and then there's a fourth dimension to me, which is an epistemological dimension, which is about research and knowledge, what kind of knowledge counts, and what I like to call male order. And there too, it's very gendered, I believe, and a lot of the male-ordered way of generating knowledge and research to me is it's quite structured and positivistic and controlled. It's typically very binary, and that's very deeply gendered. I could go on for hours about this. I won't. I've written about it in the Ideas Bulletin, which I have a few copies of it. I'll share and encourage you to visit the Ideas website to check in online. But I should probably hand over there.
Interesting, but I think at some point you'll come back to the question on time as to what is it that you look at as a time period for an intervention, so that you look at changes. You want to?
Okay, just to answer that specifically, as I said before, we're not really studying interventions. We're not spending 2 years to try and change 10 or 100 men in Nairobi. We're engaging with 20 guys in Nairobi, in Uttar Pradesh, in Kampala, in their struggles for gender justice, to try and document how they see changes happening, and it's kind of real time in a sense.
So how long do you pursue such change processes?
How long is a piece of string, and how much money have we got to keep doing this?
Well,
thank you.
On that, if I may just add, I'd like to, because we also, in the department, debate this a lot. We want more time. The donor doesn't understand, nobody understands, and we keep running out of time. But what we had experience of, our department had about 20% of the medical education curriculum, and we had opted for community-based teaching, which meant every year when the new class came, we assigned an urban poor settlement, about 15 to 20,000 population. And so we always had these communities to work with, until the whole department took a big change after 10 years. I call this institutionalizing your work for social change. And I think it is the responsibility of the institutions, not individuals. If like our institution had this commitment for nearly 15 years, we had that commitment, we were in the community. So this issue of change, of how long does it take, we could really work more intensely in greater diversity without this burden of money. And so I would like to raise the issue that this is the responsibility not of the individual researchers or activists. We are in institutions. What is the moral responsibility of the institutions? Especially, I'm talking from health. We are concerned about the health of the vulnerable. WHO says health is well-being, so we are theoretically committed to working for well-being. But I think any institution working for poverty, etc., has to see how they institutionalize this sort of a relationship, which is an ongoing one, which is not time-bound.
Very valid points. Finances definitely is one, but it's not the start all and end all of designing, interventions. Let me ask you, Ravi, before I come back to Sanjeev. Can you give us some examples on how you have factored in, the context and let's say cultural issues and so on? In some examples would be better because that would,
Okay. I
for
think we
people
have
like
to
us
give
who
a
do
lot
not
of
follow too much of theory, some examples would, be more striking.
Okay. Well, I think the contextualization to me is, drawing from the conceptualization of the process, is to understand how is that process varying from one context to another. Because I think fundamentally, a particular process, might assume different pathways of change in different contexts. So contextualization is essentially for me, is to understand if I get a clear sense of what is that process of change in different contexts. So that might, and that means that there would be different milestones of the process. There might be different expressions of the process of change. There might be different agents engaged in the part of the process, and there may be different ways of assessing the processes in different contexts. And I think all that is part of contextualizing the social change as a phenomena that we want to study in any research. And I think that's part of the skill that we learn when we undertake, as part of the student, when we were there and we were trying to understand how do you, and those exercises are often sometimes very simple, and mundane in terms of even adapting the language of your inquiry to far more complex adaptation of the conceptual scheme completely, for example, we did the GEMS, which is a gender equity movement in school, which is a program trying to promote the gender-based violence prevention in schools, which was initially done in Mumbai in an urban low-income public school setting of India. And then we, and in a randomized control trial, we did all that goes into a kind of invalidating a program. It was shown to have some effect. Now, when we took this program to Vietnam, Da Nang province, there was it was just not a straight taking the entire GEMS model as it is and implementing in Vietnam. It went through an extensive 6 to 8 months of formative research, trying to understand how is gender expressed and measured, and who are the key players in the process of change in those schools of Da Nang province, which are very different, in fact, which are different from what we had experienced in Mumbai. For example, in Mumbai schools, the process of change was initiated on the basis of peer-based model, whereas in Vietnam we had the teacher-based model, and that required a complete shift in the way we measured and we assessed the process of change in these two settings. So all the nuances we can discuss at some point if in details, but I think as Jacob was trying to explain that the gender is the key elements are there that we know conceptually, but then they find different manifestations, they find different expressions, they find different emphasis in different contexts, and that needs to be part of the contextualization process, and we often do it. We in fact we think that as a researcher there's a lot of value in investing at that stage of contextualization, in making sure that what we are defining as a social change in that context is really relevant there and has a meaningful, it has meaning in that context. So, and that's more in depth. Very usually we use a lot of qualitative and in-depth and participatory methods to get to that kind of understanding, of course.
I think you brought up the issue of whether you can implant an intervention, in a different, context, which, is not the right thing to do, and, you get these examples.
Translational process.
There has to be, you need to look at, the context and then try to bring in, whatever you had done earlier in another place and contextualize it. That's the type of, thing. I was just looking at, the time, and we are already about 2:45, got 45 minutes. I would then, skip Sanjeev to talk on contextualization and, go on to the next part on the methodologies. So, what's your take on the qualitative methods and the quantitative methods? How does it get, interwoven or juxtaposed, whatever that might be from your experience, and what's happening in the world, if you could share.
Sure. So first, I think this a very clear disjuncture between I am a quantitative person, I want quantitative evidence, and that's qualitative. I think borders on the unscientific, if not unethical, etc. But I think it's a very practical question that's being posed here. If, for example, you have a funder who says, I really want to see the following 12 indicators move, don't come and give me a long lecture on qualitative methods. I think it's in that spirit that the question is being posed here itself. So I really want to sort of engage with that question. I think first, the question is not qualitative, quantitative. It's really about how sure are you that this program made a difference, this intervention made a difference. A good crime detective does not sit around and say that's a qualitative information, that's quantitative information. A crime detective will say there's motive here, this person committed the crime. There's qualitative information, Venkatesh saw this person and Venkatesh is reliable. There is quantitative information, there's other types of DNA kinds of information. Notice how that mixed methods approach works. You are trying to really nail the case shut. Here's what we don't do. Often our program theories are so poor that we don't understand the mechanisms by which the program worked in the first place. Our motives are missing. You use the lovely word called interwoven. Too often, right now, tenure and academia and all that is decided by the types of methodologies you adopt, which is absolutely silly. We don't actually tell such great narration, etc. So I think, let's say, I want to come back to Samajjar Joridar. For me, the theory of change, and we don't have time to go into it, doesn't simply say that facilitators and animators get the bug, but the more important part is they become transformative agents. They spread, etc. So the critical part is there evidence? Not only, so if I had to kind of think of a design for Samajjar Joridar, I would start with the super conventional. There are baseline surveys at the community level. I would like to do an N-line along those lines too. But they're different. There's no reason why the entire community would have gotten infected by this. I want to see, are there differences in impact between folks who are engaged in the program in a deep level, facilitators, animators, versus a general public. So I want to study some type of dose response. But the third part, and here's where it gets exciting, is it's a multi-level intervention. I want to study, are there certain, I'm going to come back to earlier question, are there certain contexts? So as an example, did this intervention work better in primarily Dalit villages? Or did it work in other types of villages? We actually have means of studying that. Now notice the fact, and here's the important question, where did failure occur? So as an example, if you say, well actually the animators were very successful, but something happened in the spread process. That's an inherently qualitative kind of question. Now notice the fact, I'm not sitting around and saying this is qualitative, chapter number 5 is qualitative, chapter number 6 is quantitative. That's idiotic. More importantly, to kind of simply say this is what's happening here, etc. Final point. It's actually not true to say causation can only be done quantitatively. As an example, is a method called qualitative longitudinal research. I would want to study women and men. This is important. We don't only follow men, because the idea here is women's lives improve as a result of men's actions. So the question is, there's a couple of questions. When you follow women and men qualitatively, longitudinally, because it's not a pre-post design will simply not cut it. Because it's good to know that 3 months after an intervention, things are still super positive. But the claim being made is that you're transforming lives. That's a dynamic claim. And I think following folks over time. Now, when I've studied in other countries gender research, constraints start kicking in once the funders leave town. Okay, 6 months after the funder leaves town, there's more pressure on the woman to revert back to traditional roles, etc., etc. Is that happening, etc.? The question of spread. I'd be eclectic. Far too much of our methodology and evaluation come from an atomistic individual point of view. Here we're trying to transform networks. I would want to study how have networks of relationships changed between over time, etc. And here's the kicker: don't simply study it 6 months after Samajhar Jodidar. Build in something 2 years later to say actually, because it's not surprising if networks get enthused when there's new energy. The question is, does the energy persist? That's all. Stop here.